Welcome back to the show, everybody. Today I have on sex therapist, Dr. David Ley. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for fitting me in your schedule. I understand you're actually out here to do some sex therapy teaching with some other...
Yeah, I'm a clinical psychologist originally, and ended up with sex therapy, kind of certifications and training. With last name Ley, I really only had two options, right? I could be a sex doctor or a politician involved in a sex scandal. I really thought closely on that last one, but Anthony Weiner holds the title.
Yeah, God,
right?
I remember when that scandal first came out about him. I'm like, really? And his last name's Weiner? Really?
Exactly.
Really?
So one of the lucky things I get to do is travel and do trainings for mental health therapists. One of the things that a lot of people don't know is that most therapists, roughly around 85 to 90% of mental health therapists in the country, have no training in sexuality. None whatsoever. Even though, sexuality issues have something to do with people's lives, relationships, depression, satisfaction. The more sex someone has, the greater levels of life satisfaction they report.
Right.
But we're not teaching therapists to talk about sex. And so what happens is that if you are interested in a kind of sex or have more sex than your therapist, they diagnose you as a sex addict or a nymphomaniac or whatever. And so, my job now is training therapists on how to deal with modern sexuality, because society is really changing and we're becoming more open talking about sexuality issues that we've never talked about before. Those are walking in the door for therapists, and they're really kind of struggling.
That's really interesting that you say that, because, a lot of things that sex workers and girls in my industry complain about going to therapists is their fear of being judged. And actually,
Absolutely.
August Ames, who was a guest on this podcast and was a friend and was an incredibly loved performer who, committed suicide last year. When I talked to her about going to therapy, about her issues, she talked about how she felt judged for what she did. And she would go and see a therapist and, they would instantly be like, oh, well, you're a porn star. That's why you're having all of these problems. Right. Like, clearly it's your career choice.
You must have been abused. You must be depressed. You must have low self-esteem, et cetera. And unfortunately, one of the things I used to train therapists about was how to treat sex workers and porn stars, et cetera, without that judgment and shame. Because, the way the internet has changed porn is that, now there are porn stars in your neighborhood down the street, doing webcamming and everything else. And if those folks talk to their neighborhood therapist, the therapist is going to make a lot of negative judgment and assumptions. Unfortunately, there's just so much to talk about because therapists are so just woefully ignorant about sex that, I had to drop that. But it's a fun topic to talk about and really challenges a lot of assumptions. Yeah.
Now, you've got 3 books out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about each one of them and basically what they cover?
Sure. So my first book actually is called Insatiable Wives, Women Who Stray and the Men Who Love Them. And, the story of that book is kind of interesting because my day job is as a clinical psychologist. I run a large behavioral health organization. I have about 85 staff. We treat about 2,000 patients a year. And but I was clinically depressed, banging my head against managed care organizations, state bureaucracy, HR issues, et cetera. And I needed something to sink my teeth into. So I started collecting data for a ultimately unpublished study about polyamory and open relationships. But during that, I ran into these 2 couples who practice what they call the hot wife or the cuckold lifestyle. Cuckold porn is now the second most popular porn online. Mm-hmm. It wasn't at the time, and I'd never really heard of this. And I will openly admit, my knee-jerk assumption was, wow, this can't be healthy. These husbands monogamous and their wives off screwing other guys, and there's something wrong with that. But then I had to realize that these were remarkably healthy couples. Both of these first 2 couples I met had been married 20 and 30 years, had incredible marriages, wonderful communication skills, very successful families, careers, everything else. By every measure we would identify, these were healthy people. And I had to wonder, where did my assumption of ill health come from? And I realized that unthinkingly I had allowed, a lot of bias around female sexuality, monogamy, promiscuity, et cetera, to infiltrate into my clinical thinking. And so I said, wow, okay, what's going on here? And I looked at the literature. There was nothing published about it. Remember, I'm depressed. So I said, okay, let me write about this. I always wanted to write a book. I started interviewing couples, and on Craigslist, back before Sesta Fosta shut down, Craigslist. Everybody talks about the impact that Sesta Fosta had on sex workers on Craigslist and Backpage and everything else. But it also dramatically impacted sex researchers as well, because now we have difficulty finding subjects for sex research studies. And so I was posting ads on Craigslist, and couples would send me naked pictures of their wife, and I'd say, "Thank you very much. She's lovely." And I swear to God, I never had sex with a single one of these wives. But I interviewed them and interviewed the couples. And along the way, I'm reading everything I can about, female sexuality, about the history of monogamy, evolutionary psychology around sexuality development and everything else. And at the end of it, I had a book where I really challenged basically the industry that had led to me making those knee-jerk assumptions. And really uncovering the way in which this lifestyle could be done in a healthy way. It's the first and was the only kind of scholarly approach or consideration of cuckolding and hotwifing. There's now been a couple of research studies published around it. Dan Savage and I, along with a researcher named Justin Lehmiller, earlier this year published a research study about gay cuckolding, because up until recently, roughly when the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage, there wasn't any gay cuckolding.
Right.
But when the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage, all of a sudden it became kind of hot.
Yeah.
To violate that taboo.
Right.
And so all of a sudden gay cuckold as a fetish was born. And the interesting thing was that as I was doing publicity for that first book, people didn't really want to talk about female sexuality or non-monogamy, but they were really interested in this one line in the book where I described this guy who had blown through 3 marriages because he'd wanted to watch his wife with a black man. And the wives were like, okay, I'll try it. But then it, didn't work, blew up. Interestingly.
Did it blow up because they did have sex and the guy got jealous, or did they not do it and then the girls felt weird about it? Like,
kind of all the above,
okay.
And the guy was pretty obsessive about it. And I said in the book, it would be really easy to diagnose the guy as a sex addict, but I don't believe in sex addiction. The interesting thing was that was really all people wanted to talk about. They were like, well, you don't believe in sex addiction? Everybody else does. And I said, well, it's not in the DSM. The DSM is the manual of diagnoses, and it has sex addiction has been rejected from there for about 40 years based on poor science. And so I said, well, maybe I'm wrong. And so I started looking at that and that whole concept, and ended up with my second book called The Myth of Sex Addiction, where I really question and challenge that whole field. Interestingly, I'll circle back and say I was no longer depressed, because it turns out that talking to people about hot, kinky sex is almost as good for treating your depression as having lots of hot, kinky sex. And then I'll also point out that, I'm just fascinated by the way the news is bringing everything, out now. Paul Manafort just went to jail, Trump's campaign president, right? And it came out about 2 months ago that his daughters, their text messages in their phones had gotten hacked, and it was released. And it reveals that Manafort apparently was a cuckold, really loved to have his wife, have gangbangs.
I did not hear about this.
It was kept pretty quiet. I published a piece about it that didn't get a lot of attention, but Manafort loved to watch his wife, have gangbangs with black men, and then after they left, he could, kind of perform and get it up. Apparently, it was
I love that they found out because his daughters were talking.
That's right.
About
That's right. And in their text, they said, Dad, Dad and Mom think he's a sex addict, and I'm like, geez, these are my books.
Yeah.
So it's just so interesting how all of this stuff is just coming out.
Yeah. That's really interesting, because I don't know if you know this about me, but my parents were swingers, and they used to go to orgy parties, and my mom was very promiscuous, and my parents have been together since they've been together for 50 years. They've been married for almost 40 years. and they're still together, and they have, a great relationship. I have a brother and a sister. We're all very, very close as a family, and it's just been interesting to me, growing up in a sexually liberal family, with parents who were swingers, and we all know that they were swingers. I mean, it wasn't something that they certainly brought up when we were children, but we became older, we became aware of it, and we don't care.
Right.
And, I have one of the healthiest family relationships that I know of. I have lots of friends who have very conservative, Christian parents, and, have very strict morals and ideas about what sex should and shouldn't be. And I just find it ironic that, we have such a better relationship with each other. And my parents have always been, have always talked about how it's just, about open communication and about talking and about, the lack of shame and the lack of slut-shaming and that kind of thing that exists. And I just...
That shame is it's just so insidious and so damaging. I mean, all of the research at this point is really generating the inescapable conclusion that all of the sexual things that we mental health industry, society, churches, everything else, all of the sexual things that we have said were bad for people, it turns out what's actually bad is the shame associated with those behaviors.
Right.
And the more we shame people, the more damaged they become. And paradoxically, the greater difficulty they have kind of controlling those behaviors. Swinging, some recent research just last year showed that, swinging couples or individuals have the highest level of sexual satisfaction of any relationship styles. And so one of the things I talk about with folks is that, you need to know yourself. You need to understand yourself. And if you are a high libido person, if you are a person with high sexual sensation seeking, you're really interested in, pushing those edges and riding that taboo, the thrill of the unknown or the new person is really powerful to you, then you need to think carefully before committing to a monogamous relationship because that might be challenging for you.
Right, right.
Again, the fascinating thing I think that's happening nowadays is that we are offering many more options to people to fit them and options in terms of relationships. You can choose polyamory or you can choose swinging or you can choose an open relationship or this, that, or the other thing. And what's really, really fascinating to me is helping people to figure out how to negotiate and identify a sexual and relationship style that fits them.
Right.
There's this neat research with swingers that showed that swingers tend to be more politically conservative, but they are more socially liberal than most of their politically conservative counterparts. Okay, so that throughout the Midwest and the rest of the country, most swingers tend to be Republican. But even though they're Republican, they're more open-minded about gender values and gender stereotyping and less shaming around LGBT issues. There's something about being exposed to lots of other people's sex that breaks down your idea that my kind of sex is the only kind of sex that's right.
The heightened sense of level of communication.
Yeah. Now the fascinating thing is we see the same impact from people watching porn. That people who watch more porn have more egalitarian values, are more likely to support feminism, are more likely to support female rights and female autonomy. It kills me when feminists are attacking and trying to shame and shut down porn because, in fact, they should be encouraging more men to watch porn because it breaks down those ideas and barriers around, for instance, female pleasure and female autonomy.
So you don't agree with the fact that porn degrades women and makes men see women only as sex objects and only as tools of their pleasure and not as real people?
No more so than the United States Congress does these days. I mean, there are hard things in porn. There are forms of pornography that, that I find challenging to even know exist. And However, let's be clear that, pornography is media, and media reflects society. Media doesn't actually drive society. Media reflects what exists in society and is the voice of society's kind of unconscious. So everything that's in porn is in us. It's in our society. The things that we're working out in pornography are things that our society is trying to figure out, whether it's issues around racism, it's just issues around sexism, it's issues around, kink and female sexuality or homosexuality or anything. That's why that stuff is there, and that's why it's so compelling. That's why people watch it so much, because it touches something inside them that they're working through.
It's interesting that you say that because, when you look at porn and you look at the audience of certain types of porn, like say you look at Japanese porn, right? Japanese porn has a lot of bondage. It has a lot of, I don't know, quasi-rape or rape. It has a lot of kind of sexually violent images. And Japan is a pretty sexually repressed culture. So, and then also too, you look at, the people who consume, interracial porn, and a lot of those people come from red states, where there are states where there's a lot of prevalent racism, and it's mostly consumed by Americans. One thing that's really interesting that a lot of people don't know is that here in America, interracial porn, there's things called an IR rate, interracial rate. And a lot of times girls will charge more money to do a scene with a black man, right? It can command a higher rate. But that doesn't exist in Europe. IR rates, IR scenes, all that whole thing. In Europe, that's not a thing. You have sex with dudes, you have sex with guys of all color. But here in America, there's a very specific thing about having sex with black men. And interracial porn doesn't even mean a woman and a Latin man, a woman and an Asian man, or even a black woman and a white man. It's specifically a white woman and a black man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, a friend of mine is a porn performer from Florida, Demi Sutra, on Twitter, and she, African-American woman, and she and I were having drinks, and then that was one of the things she said. She said, I don't get paid more for having sex with a white man. And it's not to say that, the porn industry is lily white. And frankly, I don't think any industry is. I mean, Jesus, look at Disney. You can't say Disney's not exploiting people. Right. Look at the NFL and the concussion rates. Yeah. People who are upset and concerned about, porn performers being taken advantage of or exploited. What are they doing about NFL? Yeah. And poor African-American youth from the ghetto who are exploited in football with their brains damaged for the rest of their lives for our entertainment. Yeah. I got some issues with that. Yeah. Let's deal with the exploitation and the, all of that, all of those poor ethics throughout media and entertainment. Yeah. We single out pornography because it's sexy. And so, sex is always a sexy, shiny object that grabs people's attention and it distracts. Right. And then it brings up all these morality issues without you noticing. We treat sex differently from any other human behavior. And as a psychologist, part of my job is to try and remove my morality from working with and assessing and diagnosing and treating people. And so I have to look at sex as equivalent to any other human behavior, whether it's working or playing or sports or whatever. And when we look at it that way, we can start removing some of the shame. And then when we remove the shame, we can help people with some of these problems that otherwise they struggle greatly with. Religion is one of the things that's going on right now. Religion's been going on for thousands of years, right? But what we're seeing right now is this incredible conflict between religious values and sexual issues, specifically around porn. Porn is like the canary in a coal mine right now because, what happened, my belief, my argument is that there are, generations of people who, were not taught anything about their sexuality. They weren't taught how to understand or manage their sexual feelings. And they were taught there's a right way to have sex. Right. There's a right way to be in a relationship. Anything else is sinful and bad. Now the internet comes along and they can access porn and sexual fulfillment at a moment's notice. They do so, and it feels great, and then they feel guilty and shitty afterwards. And because they're doing and enjoying something that they were taught was bad, and by doing so makes them bad, makes them a bad person. And then when they, when they seek help, they're told, well, you're a sex addict, you're a porn addict. And, so now you're a bad person. Now you're not just a bad person, you're a diseased person. And so the people, start focusing on trying to control their sexuality, trying to suppress it. And this fascinating research from this Israeli researcher this year showed that religious people who attempt to suppress sexual thoughts experience an increase in frequency and intensity of sexual thoughts. Don't think of a naked white elephant. If you do, you're a dirty, naughty pervert. And trying to stop yourself from thinking of that naked white elephant makes you think about it a lot more.
Yeah.
And then you end up in this spiral of self-hatred. People who watch porn and are religious are more likely to identify as addicted to pornography. The predictor of identifying as a porn addict is not how much porn you watch, but it's a conflict with your religious values.
Yeah.
And so those people are really suffering and struggling right now, and deserve help. But the help they're getting right now actually typically is making it worse.
It's interesting that you say that because, just recently, obviously with the whole controversy around the Catholic Church and all the molestation cases, the Pope himself suggested that perhaps priests shouldn't be celibate and they should be allowed to marry, which to me I feel like is insanely obvious. Like sexuality is one of the strongest drives behind all human behavior. It's been instilled in us because it's right. What we need in order to procreate and to continue to exist on this planet. And so when you tell people that they can never have sex, they can never have that intimate bond with another human being, I just find that it always works itself out in some other sick and perverted ways. And, that's not just the priests in the Catholic Church. I think you can apply that to, anybody who's been sexually repressed. You see that everywhere in, countries where there's high levels of sexual repression. You have higher levels of violence against women, sex crimes, and you talk about that in your book. And so, to me, it seems incredibly obvious, but I know that that's a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow. So what do you think? I have a question though. What do you think about people? So you don't believe in sex addiction. You don't believe in porn addiction. What about people who say that they compulsively cannot stop watching porn and that it interferes with their lifestyle and it interferes with their work and that it's something they spend all their time on the internet? What do you think that is?
So, I hear that story a lot. And first I have to say that typically that is a self-correcting problem. If you lose your job because you're watching porn, eventually you're going to lose the ability to pay for the internet. And that problem's going to kind of go away. Research in Canada actually found that, so-called behavioral addictions, including porn addiction, typically resolve without treatment within 6 months to a year. This is about adjustment. It's about accommodation and adaptation. Now, what I will say, though, is that, significant research around these issues identifies that as many as 90% of these folks struggling with sex or porn addiction have another mental health issue. Typically depression or anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, sometimes autism, and this repetitive kind of obsessive, we'll call it compulsive behavior, is a symptom of something else. Now, one of the things that, it is men who are getting diagnosed with this. Women who get diagnosed as sex addicts or love addicts is typically all about slut-shaming. And these women are not typically actually having certainly as much sex as your mom did, right? But your mom was able to accommodate that and negotiate that within their marriage, so they had no problem. I actually treated this one guy who, he was obsessed with being a swinger, and his first two wives divorced him, and therapists diagnosed him as a sex addict because he really wanted to be a swinger. His third wife cured him, and he was no longer a sex addict. How did she cure him? She was a fucking swinger, right? So now this is okay,
right? Two of the people that I met that I've known in person who said that they struggle with porn addiction were both alcoholics.
Yeah, and so then we have to start looking at how is this behavior a symptom of these other problems?
Right.
Men I envy women in a lot of ways, besides the whole, multiple orgasms kind of thing, that women are taught from a very early age to express and experience negative emotions and to learn how to cope with them and deal with them. Guys are told, suck it up. Mm-hmm. And so we have all of these men who, don't know how to manage negative emotions, depression, sadness, anger, anxiety, worry. And masturbation and watching porn is a really effective way to change the way your brain is working at the moment and turn on some of those sexual kind of components of your brain that make you not worry. When we are turned on, it's hard to worry about stuff. And so that feels really good for somebody who is feeling depressed or feeling sad and really worrying a lot. The challenge is, if you're sitting in church and you're stressed out, it's not a good time to watch porn. So you need other coping strategies. And so that's what I see again with lots and lots of these guys who, most of my practice for a while was filled with these guys who were losing their job because they gotten caught looking at porn at work. And overwhelmingly, we find a couple of things. One is that these guys are, watching porn and masturbating more. Let's be clear. Every argument against porn is covertly an argument against masturbation because people jerk off when they watch porn. 90% of porn consumption is accompanied by masturbation.
And by the way, I have a solution to all of you guys who watch too much porn and masturbate to it frequently. Work in porn and you won't watch porn anymore.
Yeah.
It will ruin it for you.
Those guys, something's going on in their marriage. Typically, they stopped having sex as frequently. And research shows that men use masturbation and porn as a way to compensate for decreased sex frequency within the marriage. And also, it's not just frequency, but I've treated many men with, fetishes or, desires or interests that they couldn't fulfill within their marriage because it was shamed or not allowed, whatever. And so they use porn as a way to compensate for that. We need to look at how to help those men and couples negotiate those issues. Research looking at the effect of porn on marriages finds that if a husband and wife watch as much porn equally, or if they watch porn together, there's no negative impact on the marriage. But when the husband watches porn in secret, or when one or both of the partners are religious, the porn use correlates with negative impact on the marriage. It's not the porn here. The porn is an indicator of a mismatched libido, of inability to negotiate sexual needs within the marriage, to talk about sexuality, and that there's a lot of shame around the sexuality. And again, back to the shame. Those are the things that are causing these problems. But it's real easy to say, "Oh, see, it's porn," as opposed to digging deeper and let's treat the real issue. I mean, what I like to say is if I walk in the doctor's office and I'm sneezing, my doctor doesn't say, "David, you got a sneezing addiction. You need to stop that." Instead, tries to figure out, do I have a virus? Do I have a bacterial infection? Do I have allergies? And we have
it's really just a symptom.
That's right. We have to treat each of those differently.
Right.
Porn and porn-related problems are always universally a symptom of something else. And if we treat the porn, we're missing the point.
Right. It's interesting because I'm actually, I'm in a 12-step program. I'm a recovering alcoholic. I've been in it for years. And we always talk about how the alcoholism and drinking is absolutely a symptom of something else that's wrong with us inside. And so, we talk about how it doesn't actually even really matter whether or not your problem is alcohol or if it's drugs or if it's sex. It's always it's symptomatic of something else that's a problem in us.
Yeah.
I really liked how you talk about in Ethical Porn for Dicks, which is the book
My third book,
that I did, your third book that I did read. Because, on this show, I'm a woman. Obviously, I have a lot of women on here. A lot of times we talk about how porn and how it affects women and what is feminist porn and can there be feminist porn and, how women are affected in porn. But you really tackle porn and men in Ethical Porn for Dicks because you really want to talk to men about, how they are ashamed for watching porn and porn and sex addiction. So, What brought you to that? Did you just see that there was like a vacuum for that nobody was really ever talking?
Katie Couric.
Katie Couric.
Yeah, I dedicated the book to Katie Couric.
Okay, interesting.
Which I suspect she hates. So yeah, it was one of the most painful experiences of my life. I was asked to go on Katie's show. She had a talk show a couple of years ago, and my episode was like the last episode of the of her talk show, and it retired after that, and.
It was the very last one?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
man.
And I was also apparently I'm the curse of death. I was also one of Anderson Cooper's very last guest on his talk show. So people don't bring me on talk shows anymore.
This podcast isn't going to end after this.
Sorry, maybe I should have told you about that. Informed consent. So Katie brought me on to talk about pornography and research about pornography. And it was a really challenging experience. Katie is deeply Catholic and self-identified in the show as a prude. And as I talked about the research and kept challenging some of the myths that she was putting out there, that watching porn increases, kids having sex, and that kids are watching porn younger and younger and younger, and that porn is causing erectile dysfunction and all of these just frankly scare tactics. Mm-hmm. She got upset, and interestingly, you're in the porn industry. She said to me, David, do you work for the porn industry? And I'm like, no, I work for people who want us to make good decisions for the right reasons. Mm-hmm. She hit herself in the head one time, and on the show, and she said, if you talk about research one more time, I'm like, that's what I'm here for. But I realized after that, talking about this stuff in that way can be kind of inaccessible. Mm-hmm. And that, that's one of the things that the anti-porn and anti kind of sex people are good at, is using these anecdotes, panecdotes, one lady calls them, which I think is brilliant. I left the show. I went back to the hotel. I went to the bar. I looked like I'm sure I got run over by a truck. And the two bartenders, both men, were like, dude, what's going on? Yeah. And I'm like, yeah, this is what just happened. And they're like, wow, yeah, I watch porn and I never talk. So we ended up having this conversation. Right. We had the conversation at the bar that I wished we could have had on the show.
Right.
And I left and I said, okay, I need to figure out how to do this differently. And so I wrote Ethical Porn for Dicks, which is radically different from my other books. I wrote it for guys. It's in short sections. I wrote the book 3 different times to try and get to the right kind of style. I wrote a lot of the book on my phone in meetings when I got bored. Mm-hmm. Not during therapy. I don't pull out my phone during therapy, but during like business meetings and stuff.
Right.
And I wrote it not talking about the research, but talking about porn as though I was having a beer with a guy.
Yeah.
Because
I noticed it was very accessible language. It wasn't very verbose. It wasn't filled with a lot of superfluous words.
Data says.
Yeah.
And because guys are the ones that are getting thrown under the bus right now, testicles first.
Right.
In all of this issue. And guys can't really talk about it. And guys, if a guy gets caught watching porn by his wife or girlfriend, then it's assumed, he's cheating on her with the porn. Interestingly, this neat research compared the belief that watching porn is cheating between Americans and Europeans, and found that in the Americans, having low self-esteem, less experience of pornography, and not actually being in a relationship right now increased the chances that someone would view pornography as cheating. Mm-hmm. And being religious overwhelmingly drove it. But interestingly, in the European population, being religious and low self-esteem didn't predict perceiving pornography as infidelity. And I talked to the author, and he said, Europeans don't take infidelity and don't take religion as seriously as Americans do.
That's so true. My mother's British.
Oh, well, there you go. There you go.
Yeah, exactly. So she's always like kind of laughed at how, I remember the one thing that she said to me was, she never really saw cheating as like a great reason to leave your spouse. There was another quote by a woman who was married to an incredibly famous actor. and she was also British, and he had a lot of affairs with other women, and she never left him. Oh God, I think he died recently, or maybe she died recently, and they asked her, and she just basically said, like, it's kind of not that big of a deal to me that he's had these affairs with these other women. He always came home to me in the end. And she said something along the lines of how other people really wanted her to make a big deal about it. Mm-hmm. But people were offended that she wasn't that offended.
Right. It's not that, infidelity, is a great thing. And it's not that I'm recommending infidelity to people. But I am saying that, again, we treat sexuality there as though it is intrinsically a moral thermometer that indicates, you can be you can be a wonderful, amazing person who gives to charity and takes care of kittens and every other wonderful, amazing thing, but you get caught cheating, and all of a sudden you are rock bottom slime. Mm-hmm. And there's a belief that sexual infidelity, reveals your true moral character. Mm. Because again, we're treating sex separately and differently from every other behavior. And I think that Europeans, largely because they are less religious, are putting less pressure on sex and view infidelity as, well, it's something we wish didn't happen. But I also wish, you didn't cheat on your taxes.
Yeah. It's kind of like that whole situation where everybody couldn't believe the huge deal that Americans were making over the Bill Clinton scandal, with Monica Lewinsky. Yeah. Like the rest of the world was like, dude, who, you know what I mean? Like, who cares what he does in his personal life? But, for us, it was grounds for impeachment.
Right.
Whereas, don't get me started on our current president. Mm-hmm. We won't get into that, but,
It is truly fascinating the degree to which our sexual conflict has now just erupted into social dialogue. And you look at the Me Too movement, and you look at politics these days. It is all us working through that sexual conflict. And, you mentioned, rough sex or simulated rape porn earlier, and data is very clear that women search for and seek out rough sex, violent sex porn more than men do.
Okay, I was going to ask you about that because I'm totally into that shit.
Okay.
Like in my own personal life, I'm very submissive. I definitely like rough sex. That is very hot to me. Now, I don't produce any of that kind of stuff. But I don't fault people who do, as long as, it's between consenting adults and a lot of these girls are on board for that kind of thing. A lot of girls that I know and that I talk to are really into that kind of rough sex. So, why do you, and there's the whole like rape fantasy thing with women. I had Christopher Ryan on this show. You guys should listen to the episode if you haven't already. He's an author. He wrote Sex at Dawn. And I asked him.
He's a good friend of mine.
Yeah, he's amazing. Great guy. And I asked him about that. I said, why do you think that's the case? And he talks about how he believes that, society has repressed female sexuality for so long. And, we're supposed to feel bad about enjoying sex, that almost in some strange way, being forced to have sex is like the only way, is like we no longer have responsibility for the sex. It takes away that responsibility.
It overcomes that internal kind of prohibition and barrier.
Right.
Then you're not a slut because you didn't choose it. You got kind of forced into it.
Right.
We also, we have romanticized and idealized that kind of ravishment fantasy, for many years. Every romance novel, involves, the power of the man overcoming the woman, and she swoons.
It's so interesting you say that, because I remember I used to read cheesy romance novels when I was very young. And I remember reading this one, and this is before, like, I really, I was young, so I didn't really know what I was into sexually, obviously, but I was reading one, and there was this line where, the bad guy, calls a woman into his bedroom and he calls her a slut. And I remember instantly being turned on and being like, and then going back and rereading that over and over again. And being turned on by that and being confused that I was turned on by that.
Now there is interesting research showing that, women physiologically respond with sexual arousal to material that they don't necessarily find psychologically arousing. And that lubrication, the blood flow in the vagina, may have been essentially a protective measure that evolved in order to protect women from developing infections or from abrasions during rape, right?
Wow.
If you get lubricated more easily,
You're
then
less likely to tear.
That's right. And so there is some speculation. I think it's an interesting theory that that women actually are much more sexually responsive and arousal response to sexuality than men, at a much more general universal level. But as Chris said, we slut shame women for showing that you're turned on or being sexual. So women are taught to suppress it and not express it. And then women don't get the chance to kind of work through that stuff. And then we tell them, if you have this fantasy, you're bad. I mean, again, I don't mean to be a broken record about this, but the sex addiction industry for 25 years said that if you had fantasies of BDSM, bondage, discipline, submission, stuff like that, that you were a pervert and you were sick and you were diseased. And then what changed it was 50 Shades of Grey. When 50 Shades of Grey sold over 100 million copies, and all of a sudden they had to face the fact that there were housewives around the country, their own wives, wanted this. They had to. They then all of a sudden they turned and they said, well, okay, maybe that's normal.
Right.
I think that, the interesting thing is in the United Kingdom, British, mom's British, but they are in a very conservative area right now, regarding porn. They are restricting access to porn. One of the first kinds of pornography they restricted access to was this rape and simulated violent porn. Under the premise that would prevent rape. But in fact, it's the reverse. Access to that kind of pornography and access to pornography in general reduces rates of sexual violence in societies. Now,
right.
And as they were banning rape porn in the United Kingdom, they preferentially were impacting female porn consumers because that's what they watch. Now, I will say, and there's a researcher here at UCLA, Neil Malamuth, who's a brilliant guy. He and I are on different sides of the table, but he's got good research that shows that there is about 6% of men who, if they watch rough sex, violent sex, simulated rape porn, that it does increase their chances of engaging in sexual violence. But the thing is, it's not the porn, it's the guy, because those guys, he's already predisposed to that. He is a guy with substance use issues who is disinhibited. He's a guy who is, sociopathic and doesn't think the rules, apply to him. And he's a misogynist. He views women as property and things to be grabbed because you can, right?
Grab them by the pussy.
I didn't say that. Those issues are the things that predispose guys to engaging in sexual violence. Violent porn may tip them over the edge. However, there's no evidence and there's no research whatsoever that says changing or restricting access to that porn reduces those guys' rates of violence. Mm-hmm. But keeping them sober, teaching them not to be misogynistic dicks, and teaching them to follow the rules do reduce rates of sexual violence. And so, again, porn is this sexy, shiny object that we're like, oh, let's go after that, as opposed to dealing with all the rest of the issues. It's
kind of like video games,
yes,
guns,
violence. That's right. Video game addiction, that's the latest kind of thing. And again, there's, tremendous evidence showing that, kids who struggle with video game addiction, have lots of other issues. And even more interestingly, that the criminologists, therapists, and researchers who believe in video game addiction just happen to be older people with more negative attitudes towards video games and youth and less experience of video games. And so again, this is bias. Mm-hmm. And we need, in order to help people who are struggling with these issues, we need to remove that bias, because bias leads to shame, and shame actually makes it harder to change or reduce these problems.
Right. Now, I want to also talk about another part of your book that I found really interesting. where you talk about women suppressing the sexuality of other women, not necessarily men. So you wrote social psychologist Roy Baumeister and Jean Twenge wrote a powerful scholarly article where they argued that women actually suppress the sexuality of other women, not men. Their premise was that control of sexuality was historically one of women's only commodities, and that women had to control the market, so to speak, by stigmatizing, shaming, and suppressing those who might offer free, cheap, or easy sex. So it's the whole idea of no one's going to buy the cow if they can get the milk for free, which is, a phrase that I fucking hate.
I know.
And you actually also talk about a really interesting conversation that you saw on Twitter between sex workers about, their rates of prostitution. So I kind of want you to talk a little bit about that because I found that to be really interesting.
Yeah, what Baumeister and Twenge, found was that it is typically women who act to suppress or control the sexuality of other women, not men. And, Mae West said it very, very well. She said, men love a slut because they hope history is going to repeat itself. Women are typically the opponents against porn. Women are typically the opponents against, sex work and sex work legalization. Because it affects the market cost of sex. How much are you as a person, as a man, going to invest in order to get sex? Are you going to invest, in a marriage and family and stability in order to get sex? Now, husbands who do invest in that get more sex. Mm-hmm. Married men have more sex than single men. Mm-hmm. So marriage is,
really?
Yeah, really. Across their lifespan, I swear to God, isn't that interesting? That
it's like the opposite of what most people
that's
say.
Right. But if you look over time, they are more likely to have more sex. I mean, one thing you have to understand, and I'm going to get back to the point, but is that throughout human history, research with mitochondrial DNA shows that 80% of the human females who ever lived on this planet reproduced, had children, but only 40% of the human males who ever lived on this planet reproduced. 60% of men died young, died before they could reproduce, or never had access to reproduction. Mm-hmm. Because powerful, wealthy men kept all the hot chicks to themselves, right? With harems and everything else. The traditional marriage in the Bible is polygamy. It's not monogamy. Mm-hmm. So when conservatives tell me they support traditional marriage, I always laugh. Wow, you're into polygamy? How many wives have you got, dude? But coming back to this female suppression issue is that women's only really commodity throughout much of history was sexuality. Now, in societies where women had greater economic independence and greater control of their own economy, there was greater rates of female infidelity. Mm-hmm. And even today, as women's income goes up, infidelity goes up, approaching rates of men, because if the woman gets caught, she doesn't lose everything, right? And she's not on the street homeless. So that sex was the only commodity that many women had, and they had to control the price of it in order to get the stability and protection and care for themselves and their children. Now, we live in a different society, though, now, and we live in a society where women have much greater independence and economic abilities of their own. Gail Dines is, a very famous anti-porn activist, and she's a professor, and, she's really, really rabid against pornography. But one quote that she gave one time I cite often. She said, feminist sex workers and porn stars are the scabs of feminism. And, a scab is somebody who undercuts your price. A scab is somebody who goes against the union, goes against the collective. Mm-hmm. She's saying that women who sell sex are, undercutting the price that other women can charge for sex. She's acknowledging this isn't about sex. This isn't about morality. This is about control.
Right. Right. Yeah. Because the idea, if sex is this expensive, hard to access thing, you've got to take a girl out on a certain number of dates. You've got to spend a certain amount of money on dinner before she gives it up. But as opposed to if you're just going to give it up for free on the first date, then you're a slut. It's supposed to be something that you're supposed to hold and give out sparingly and begrudgingly. And what happens when the idea is if a woman can give sex as freely as a man does, then does she no longer have any value?
Mm-hmm. And you had the slut walk here in LA yesterday. And Amber Rose, for several years has been leading this slut walk again of people coming out and saying, look, just because we're not, keeping our legs together the way you say we're supposed to, doesn't mean we're bad people. And that shame that you keep hitting us with is what is causing the harm.
Right.
It's causing the damage. And, but porn puts a high-speed milk faucet in the bedroom. Mm-hmm. And now there are lots of guys who are choosing to masturbate to porn rather than pursue a relationship, because sometimes a relationship can be too dramatic, too challenging, too demanding for them. And frankly, it is easier, right? Because, the internet is very easy to satisfy. You don't have to buy dinner for it to put out. The women in porn come very easily. You don't have to be a particularly good lover, as you sit there and masturbate. And all you got to do to turn it on is push the button.
Right.
And that unfortunately is one of the challenges, is that people are learning lessons from pornography that don't translate very well to real sex. Because pornography, when you film porn, it doesn't show all the negotiation. It doesn't show all the preparation because it's fantasy. It's not supposed to.
Right.
When we watch Venom, it doesn't, we don't see all the special effects that make this impossible thing possible.
Right.
Right? And we're not supposed to.
Right.
It's escape. Porn is escape too. The problem is that we have grossly neglected adolescents and children in our society, and we have generations now of kids who were taught nothing about sex because abstinence only kind of education. And now they're learning about sex from porn, and then everybody's all upset. Well, they're learning bad lessons. Well, whose fucking fault is that?
That is so true. I mean, the lack of sexual education here in the States is absolutely incredible.
It's appalling. And in the Netherlands, where they start with developmentally appropriate sex education as early as 6 and 7, with, letting kids see what genitalia and naked bodies look like at those early ages. Lower rates of sexual violence, lower rates of teen pregnancy, much greater levels of healthy kind of self-directed sexuality, because they're removing the shame.
Right. So do you think then that there is a way that porn can be beneficial and helpful to people?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I see, for instance, gay people consume more porn than straight people. Right. Why? Because oftentimes they're living in the closet, and that is their one outlet. Marcus Bachmann is a psychologist and a minister and husband of Michelle Bachmann, Republican politician. Bachmann argues that porn causes people to become gay through porn addiction. Porn is apparently a slippery slope coated in KY. You start at the top looking at Playboy, you end up at the bottom fucking sheep and other men. So porn can be an outlet, and porn can also teach us about our sexual desires. One of the things I talk about with guys is, what kind of porn you watch, because I think it's really important. It actually shows us something. Porn is sexual fantasy made external, made visible to other people. And so when I talk to you about what kind of porn you watch, what kind of women you like in porn, who's your favorite performer, and why do you like her? Well, she seems really genuine. She seems to really enjoy it. She doesn't seem to get all uptight and upset. And then I can say, so that's what you really are interested in real life. You would really like to have a partner who is, laid back about sex and into it as much as you are, and lets you feel good about being dirty and perverted with her. And guys go, oh, yeah, kind of. And then, wow, so the women you've been having sex with don't act that way. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about why. And let's talk about maybe how you can find women that will act in those kinds of ways with you, and how you can create a relationship where they can. Those are the things we can learn about sex from porn.
That you can use porn as a barometer to actually see like what kind of women that you would actually have a healthy relationship with, as opposed to the kinds of women that you might think you would have a healthy relationship.
That's right.
It's an interesting insight into one's psyche that I would have never thought of it that way.
And one of the very common forms of porn right now is cuckold porn, that is really increased in frequency and popularity over the past few years. And one of the really common elements in it, and in a lot of cuckold fantasy, is forced bisexuality, where the man is forced by his dominant wife or her male lover to engage in homosexual behaviors. That is the exact same thing as the rape fantasy in women. It is men wanting to engage sexually with the other man, but they have to be forced into it. They have to be forced over the hump, so to speak. And that, again, helps us then to understand, and helps us to understand some of those suppressed or shamed secret bisexual fantasies that the man might have, but doesn't feel like it's okay to express.
Right. Dr. Ley, thank you so much for coming on. This has been really, really interesting. I want to make sure that everybody knows that they should get his books, Insatiable Wives, Ethical Porn for Dicks, and what was the third one?
The Myth of Sex Addiction.
The Myth of Sex Addiction. And what's your website and social media handles they can find you on?
Yeah, at Twitter, at Dr. David Ley, last name is Ley, is the best way to find me. I'm kind of lazy. I don't really have a website. You can find me on Psychology Today. I write a lot there. And if you just Google David Ley or Dr. David Ley, that's the website that pops up the most. And you can find lots of blog stuff that I've written about all of this stuff and about sexual psychology.
Is there anything that you want to leave, especially the men listening to the podcast today, with any last words of advice or wisdom about porn? And
one guy who read Ethical Porn for Dicks, he read an early version of it, and I wish that I had had the ability to put his quote in the book. He said after reading the book, he went and he talked to his wife about porn and about his porn consumption. And they'd never really had an honest kind of conversation about it, where she wasn't judging him for porn or feeling like it was cheating and everything else. And he said they left the conversation with kind of a realization that porn for him was the same thing as her vibrator was for her. Her vibrator was a way for her to achieve arousal and orgasm more quickly or efficiently than she could otherwise. Porn was the same thing. It was a vehicle for him to achieve and self-manage kind of his arousal, sexual desires. When they removed some of that moral pressure, then they got to talk about this stuff and then talk about how to make it part of their relationship and their sex together. That's the kind of conversation I want guys to have.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you so much again for coming on. And you guys can follow me at Holly Randall on Twitter and on Instagram. And if you'd like to support this podcast, please go to patreon.com/Holly Randall Unfiltered. And I'll see you guys next week.